area in which the United States was deeply affected was in minority groups, encompassing gay Americans, African Americans, women, as well as Native Americans, who received unfair rights, privileges, and in some instances barred from voting, owning property, and receiving an education.
The occupation of various forts in Ohio Country and the Great Lakes region following the French and Indian War threatened the existence of Native Americans they encountered, and thus animosity grew amongst the tribesmen toward the British. The British treated their neighbors arrogantly, refused to supply them with free ammunition, building additional forts and permitting the settlement of whites on land belonging to Native Americans. In response, Pontiac established a Native American Confederation of the Ottawas, Wyandots, Potawatomis, and Ojibwa. They attempted sieges from the fort at Detroit, Fort Pitt in Pennsylvania, where they achieved very little success. Without hesitating, the British planned an offensive campaign to the Ohio River Valley and Great Lakes region. On the last day of the rebellion in 1766, a treaty was agreed upon with Pontiac after the defeat of the Native Americans, who later agreed to further move west, which would enable future westward expansion. However, the rebellion demonstrated that tribal cooperation could be successful against colonial expansion, which influenced future resistance such as Joseph Brand and Tecumseh.
During the mid-1850s, women were opposed to several restrictions placed upon them due to sexual discrimination, and their opposition grew even stronger with a religious revival known as the Great Awakening that challenged societal values. Accompanied by the urge to abolish slavery and with increasing political rights, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton began the Seneca Falls Convention to express the ideals of a new declaration known as the Declaration of Sentiments. The first day's session was devoted towards revising the original Declaration of Sentiments and was read over several times to encompass women's suffrage as well. The second day, July 20th, 1848, among the two was most significant in that the Declaration of Sentiments and additional grievances and resolutions were addressed and presented. During this session, it was announced that the Married Women's Property Act allowed women to own property. In addition, the Declaration of Sentiments was signed by the women at the convention. To this day, it is considered the organized first wave of feminist movement in America and symbolized the effort by women to gain greater rights to gain equality with men. It also formed the basis of the women's suffrage movement, prohibition, and early abolitionism, as evident in the passage of the 18th and 19th Amendments.
On August 28, 1963, Martin Luther King gave a 17-minute speech called the I Have a Dream speech in Washington, D.C. It called for racial equality and an end to discrimination as expressed under the American Civil Rights Movement. The speech itself adopted the style of a sermon while simultaneously appealing to emotion by referencing to the Emancipation Proclamation, the Declaration of Independence, and the U.S. Constitution. After it was delivered, it lingered in the minds of Americans for days and was thought by many to move the crowd and that it would never be forgotten. This speech achieved the impact of not only advocating the passage of civil rights legislation, but it also ridiculed the idea of segregation and its lack of purpose. On that day, officials, police officers, and the public in general were told to be cautious. In fact, a state of emergency was declared. The National Guard and all of Washington, D.C. police forces were called out. However, in the end, no chaos broke out. The only thing that broke out was the sheer determination of African Americans to gain equality in America.
Although the efforts of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the African American civil rights movement appealed to many using nonviolent methods, several racist whites who disliked the advancements that were being granted towards African Americans sought to do something to prevent this. They sought to end such progress by killing the leader of this movement. On April 4, 1968, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. went to Memphis, Tennessee to support African Americans during a sanitation worker strike due to unequal wages and working conditions, he was shot by James Earl Ray on the top floor of the Loren Motel. In response to this event, Robert F. Kennedy delivered a speech to acknowledge the death of Martin Luther King and to pray for his family. This speech, as the New York senator predicted, caused the audience to scream and riot. In addition, both Stokely Carmichael and James Farmer urged for riots, which eventually escalated into large-scale protests in several U.S. cities, primarily Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Maryland, Louisville, Kentucky, Kansas City, Kansas, and Chicago, Illinois, and the submission of the terms to sanitation workers.
In society back then, being gay was considered a mental illness. However, this was about to be changed. On June 28, 1969, riots on a smaller scale occurred to protest the rights of the gay community in New York City. The event began when a group of New Yorkers protested against police officers who were raiding the Stonewall Inn bar. The crowd of 2,000 people witnessed the police arresting several bar employees and began to openly fight the police. Ultimately, the rioters were dispatched with the arrival of the riot control squad, but protesters still gathered the following day in support of gay rights. This event signified that the minority community had the ability to fight against discrimination, such as starting a march with 10,000 followers. It also allowed Americans to establish gay bars, pride parades, and prevented them from being harassed, bashed, arrested, or thrown into rehabilitation because it successfully accomplished the goals under the American gay rights movement.